The first face-to-face talks in weeks. Representatives from Russia and Ukraine meet in Istanbul, but what are the chances of a breakthrough? And who will have to compromise? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Istanbul's Moscow-Kiev peace talks. The death toll is rising by the day, and millions of Ukrainians have fled their homes in search of safety. Attempts to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine have fallen short so far, but Ankara is hoping it can lay the foundations for peace here in Istanbul. Ahead of the talks, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said it's up to Moscow and Kiev to end this tragedy.
The
negotiation process, which you have been carrying out under the orders of your leaders, has raised hopes for peace and excited the whole world. In that framework, we support the talks with all our hearts. Achieving a ceasefire and peace as soon as possible is to the benefit of everyone. We think we have now entered a period where concrete results need to be obtained from talks. The progress you will make in negotiations will also make the next level, a meeting between leaders, possible. We're also ready to host such a meeting. Even you coming together like this here is a reason for hope in the world and your countries.
So while there is hope, the fact remains that Russia's attack on Ukraine has created a devastating humanitarian crisis. According to the UN, as of Sunday, almost 4 million refugees have fled the country, and about 6.5 million others have been internally displaced. That's more than a quarter of the entire population. Kiev says it hopes the talks will at the very least find a way to ease the humanitarian crisis.
The minimum aim is, first of all, humanitarian questions, and the maximum program is a ceasefire and reaching a lasting agreement on it. The President of Ukraine gave clear instructions to our delegation. We do not trade people, land, or sovereignty. This is not a subject for negotiation. Here, our position is reinforced concrete, supported by international law and Ukraine's armed forces, international sanctions that have been applied against Russia, and weapons that have been handed over to us to deter the aggressor.
So with both sides insisting certain demands are met, negotiations will be tough. So who's at the table matters, and it hasn't gone unnoticed that among those attending in Istanbul is oligarch Roman Abramovich. The Chelsea Football Club owner and Russian billionaire was allegedly poisoned when attending earlier peace talks at the Ukraine-Belarus border. The Kremlin has dismissed those claims, suggesting they're part of an information war. Abramovich's part in the talks isn't clear, but it's believed he's playing a mediation role between Moscow and Kiev. And as the first day in Istanbul came to an end, Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said meaningful progress has been made.
Today, we are pleased to see that rapprochement between the parties has increased at every stage. We are very pleased to contribute and support this process. As we always emphasize, the top priority is to achieve a ceasefire as soon as possible and pave the way for a permanent political solution. This war, which led to the deaths of thousands and the displacement of millions of people, must stop now. At the meeting held here today, we see that progress has been made in this regard. Consensus and common understanding was reached on some issues. The most meaningful progress since the start of the negotiations was made today.
Now, details of that progress are still to be revealed, but joining me now to discuss the outcome thus far are from Istanbul, Enes Bayrakli. He is a political analyst and associate professor at the Turkish-German University. Peter Zalmayev is in Kiev. He is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. It's a nonprofit organization aiming to reinforce democratic institutions in post-Soviet countries. And from Moscow, Sergey Utkin, the head of the Strategic Assessment section at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Thanks all so much for being with us. So, halfway through, we're hearing of meaningful progress. Other delegates have said it's been constructive. So, Peter, let me first assess your sense of optimism here and where you think actual scope for compromise may have been found.
Well, initially we heard, Financial Times reported that, there may be some progress. Russia is stepping back from its demands that Ukraine demilitarize, denazify, that, it replaced its government, so all the right notes, etc. But, I'm not hopeful. We've heard this before. Russia is a very, very, very tricky partner to deal with. Even before the invasion, if you remember, the Russians said they're pulling troops back from the borders, and right away, a few days later, they invaded, all and started bombarding throughout the territory of Ukraine. These bombardments continue to happen, despite what Vladimir Putin's henchmen, or diplomats are saying. That they're willing to compromise, they're willing to meet, and to negotiate peace. What I'm seeing is the tried and, unfortunately untrue tactic by the Russians to stall for time as Vladimir Putin's troops have bogged down in Ukraine. They have stretched thin. They are having problems with supply lines and logistics. They're trying to regroup. They have said that they're going to concentrate in the Donbass. I don't believe that either. Kiev, I believe, remains the target, the prize, the trophy for Vladimir Putin. He's going to try to play for time. He's going to try to regroup and try to attack Kiev a second time. So I'm very, very pessimistic. And let me just, Andrea, say that there's a date coming up, which is very important to Vladimir Putin. That's the Victory Day of May 9th. It's a highly symbolic date, obviously, and all indications are that he's going to try before that day to do another push to declare some sort of a victory. For that, he's been pulling troops from as distant as Tajikistan, Armenia, Georgia. He's even talked about, trying to bring some Syrian fighters, even Hezbollah that we've heard. So I'm very, very skeptical.
Okay. Let me turn to Sergey then in Moscow. I want to get your opinion on what you've heard Peter say there. I mean, is this more of kind of a cynical ploy right now by Russia, that they're kind of participating in these talks to pretend that there's some kind of goodwill and interest in bringing peace when they really are actually waiting to implement a broader strategy that will destroy Ukraine even further?
I understand that there is a very high level of distrust on both sides, and it's not easy to see these negotiations as optimistic. But at the same time, I'd say you can play on time if you have this time. And for both Russia and Ukraine, every day of this military campaign brings more troubles. And while you have all reasons to accuse one side of starting that and the other you can see as the one that defends it. Nevertheless, every day means more suffering and destruction, which means that in at least some respects, a number of people in both Kiev and Moscow have to be interested in progressive negotiations that lead to a result. At least we could see in both negotiations teams some faces that make it look way more serious than it was in the previous rounds. And in spite of the fact that I would not be, again, too optimistic about the outcomes of the negotiations, I would think that this is a very serious effort facilitated by Turkey, and this is exactly the opportunity to show to all the decision makers in both capitals that a deal that would respect the red lines of both sides is actually possible.
But you do believe then at least Russia's participation in these talks is sincere, because Peter seems to think it really isn't.
I think Russian resources in this military campaign are not unlimited, and Russia is suffering as a country because of sanctions pressure, because of the losses on the battlefield, and this cannot continue like that for months and months. You have to bring it to some point when you actually negotiate on at least some things that you can agree upon with Ukraine.
And hopefully this is that point. Let me turn to Enes Bayrakli now. I know you lost us for a bit. We lost your connection. So let me turn to Turkey's role in this. Turkey is very much focused on easing the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, really regardless of how entrenched the sides are in their demands. So do you think progress can at least be made on that humanitarian front, even while there's still no full clarity, really, on who controls what?
Yes, I think we can be more optimistic today because I think Russia has realized its own limits in Ukraine. In the beginning of the military campaign, Russia had more maximalist demands from Ukraine, but now we are seeing that Russia is redefining what a victory for Russia may look like. And on the humanitarian side aspect of this, of course, it is really difficult. During a military campaign, if you look at the situation in Mariupol, to open a humanitarian corridor, so there has to be an agreement. And unfortunately, and I have to add this, Russia doesn't have a good history of in these issues, especially during its military campaigns, be it in Syria or in Chechnya or in other regions. So it's really difficult. But I think Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he can play a constructive role here by using his own personal relations with President Putin, and maybe he can convince him to open these corridors in order to save more lives.
Right. There is certainly potential there, given the relationship between Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine. Let me go look at military strategy. Peter, I want to come back to you because, many thought sorting out the status of Donetsk and Luhansk would either, prevent the war or now, in a sense, hold the key to resolving the war. But Russia has gone so much further into Ukraine. So was that part, do you think, of a larger strategy to either take more or just to create so much fear and havoc that Russia would eventually be guaranteed Luhansk and Donetsk as a concession?
Well, I think I'm not a military strategist, but I speak with military experts on a daily basis. We've kind of all become military experts by virtue of just perusing the news and discussing them. And from what the looks of it, I think it would have been strictly from the military strategy position, it would have been more advantageous for Russia to have limited its, from the get-go, its military goals and concentrated on the east of Ukraine. It would have been much more doable. I think Vladimir Putin's decision to go like shock and awe across Ukraine's territory bespeaks his gross miscalculation of the Ukrainians' willingness to fight and to resist. He, I think, was calculating that with this sort of campaign, he would cow Ukrainian leaders. Zelensky would flee the very minute he heard explosions in the morning of the February 24th, and they would parade on the street of on the main street in Kiev. As evidence of this, Ukrainian forces have uncovered parade uniforms from captured Russian fighters. So Vladimir Putin had, in mind an old school 19th century kind of war of conquest. He wanted to install a puppet regime in Kiev, and he has failed at that. And so right now, what we're seeing is he's trying to do what he should have done. If I were Russian president, he should have done limited campaign in the east. He really took more of a bite that he could chew and swallow.
Okay. So, Sergey, do you think he miscalculated and that's why they're negotiating now? Or was the idea to go for much more than what he was really after in order to get the fraction that he really did want?
It's not that easy to get inside the black box of Russian decision-making. And indeed, you have these assessments that probably the plans have changed seriously. At the same time, you have official commands saying that the plans are strictly respected, that everything goes in accordance with what was planned. Again, many people don't believe this. And I think what we should concentrate on at this point is not like figuring out what was the Russian plan initially. On that, you will probably have interesting memoirs published, be it in 50 years from now. But on what can be done to stop the hostilities and indeed to get a deal that could work for both sides. At least today, we heard from Ukrainian negotiators that this is possible, and they seem to be like several steps more hopeful and optimistic than many commentators who look at that from the outside.
Okay. I think people are looking back, though, at what the strategy may have been and whether or not Russia miscalculated to see where they might go in these negotiations and try to understand what they are actually after from within the Kremlin. But let's move on to, Sergey, I'm going to stick with you for a second because I want to look at who's at the table in these talks. You know, we had to mention, of course, Roman Abramovich. We've seen so much attention placed on him. He's supposedly playing this role of mediator somehow. Why do you think he is involved, and on whose behalf?
Well, I don't think he's the chief negotiator or anything, but he is, of course, someone who has very good connections on the very top of the Russian political system, and he has access to the money world. And of course, all the Russian major businessmen, they are horrified by what's happening. They lost a lot because of sanctions. They did not prepare for this kind of war happening. And now they very much want to find a way out. So their interest is probably to make sure that if the hostilities are over, then also at least a number of very severe sanctions that the West imposed on Russia and on the Russian businessmen, even if they live abroad for ages, they also get lifted. I think it is good to have such a sort of heavyweight people also from the business world there, but the key negotiators are those who come from the Russian presidential administration, from the Ministry of Defense, maybe to an extent from the MFA. They can have a word on the wording of the documents, on what is being shaped as a possible solution. And Mr. Abramovich probably provides some political weight and channels of communication that could help.
Okay, interesting take. Enes, let me get your opinion on it as well. I mean, do you think the right delegates really are at the table now, including Abramovich?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, if the countries has chosen these delegates to send to Istanbul, I think it's their choice, and of course these negotiations I think are the beginning of this process. We can say that the real negotiations started in Istanbul today, because before that there were negotiations, of course, in Belarus, but we cannot consider Belarus as a neutral country in this conflict, because the Russian army is invading also Ukraine from Belarus territory. It was more like Russia was trying to dictate its own terms to Ukraine in the beginning. However, because of the military campaign and the realities on the ground, Russia has, as I said, rescaled its own, goals in Ukraine. And now we are seeing real negotiations going on. And I think we have a real chance after today's declarations. There might be a breakthrough in the coming, weeks in these negotiations. And I think Turkey's role here is really important. That both sides, both actors, they trust Turkey. Not only both actors, but also our allies in the West, NATO, and also European Union. So I think this is really important. And of course, this crisis, Turkey also has huge interest in both countries. And Turkey wants to solve this problem as soon as possible, because it's also impacting Turkey, economically speaking, at least.
Right. It's interesting. Peter, I can address this to you. As you know, I mean, Russia has complained before about, in a sense, feeling very misunderstood, especially when it comes to the international press, that the whole world is against Russia unfairly. Do you think there's any way to kind of reconcile that, or do you think that would be seen as kind of kowtowing to what is this, I don't know, unjustifiably fragile ego?
Well, I mean, just to make sure I understand the question correctly, Vladimir Putin is what we've seen over his 22-year rule. I mean, he's has always conducted his policy towards these self-fulfilling prophecies. You know, they present a totally warped picture of what's happening to their own people. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, as you may know, has imposed a veritable informational blockade on his own citizens to where they are not seeing what is really happening. And then when this opprobrium, this incredible ostracism is happening, McDonald's is pulling out, Starbucks is pulling out, Apple is pulling out. All of a sudden, he's showing like, look, these people do not like us, they hate us, and to me, that is a very troubling sign. Vladimir Putin wants to build and has built, in fact, this impregnable fortress in people's minds. You know, they're a besieged fortress. No matter what they do, no one will like them. You know. And the idea that's why people have Joe Biden is saying that Vladimir Putin should not remain in power. I mean, he's wishing for his removal because for as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, there's this warped reality where people are not seeing cause and they're not being able to separate cause from effect. You know,
Sergey, let me ask Sergey, being in Moscow, I mean, being in Russia, is that true?
Well, you have people reacting differently, and of course, you have very serious effect of the state media on what people think about the conflict and about the sanctions. Indeed, you have many who treat the sanctions effects sort of separately from what's happening in Ukraine, and that is a problem in terms of people's ability to think critically and to make their own judgments. But at this point, I don't think you can fix issues like this. So basically, if there is any way to end hostilities anytime soon, you would need negotiations with the kind of Russia you have these days and the kind of Russian leadership you have these days. You may not hope that the attitude of the population will change first, because if we wait for that, a lot of more people will just die, get wounded, and flee Ukraine before any positive changes could be expected. So I think we should concentrate on possibility to bring those talks to a meaningful result.
Okay. Let me get, Enes, one final issue here. You know, we've been hearing a lot about NATO's role here, and now it's turned into an issue of Ukraine's potential neutrality in these negotiations. So is that simply a guarantee somehow that Ukraine would say we will not join NATO? And is that what NATO and Turkey and the other Western countries involved want?
I think if you look at NATO, NATO is also not willing to accept Ukraine as a member today. So it's an issue, and neutrality can be a good solution to this problem. And there is a good example. If you look at Austria and Austria's position after the Second World War, it was occupied, and then they agreed to give the independence to Austrians only on the condition of neutrality. And still, Austria became a member of the European Union. And today there were some declarations, there were some statements from the, I think, Russian side that Ukraine can be, after a peace agreement, a member of the European Union. And I think this can be a good solution. However, of course, the Ukrainian side has to agree on this, and of course, Ukrainian population has to agree on this. But the neutrality can be a good solution in this issue, because also Ukraine has found itself, entrapped between Russia and the Western allies. Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO. However, the NATO side is not ready to accept Ukraine because of Crimea is occupied. And Donbass is occupied, and now NATO is not ready to transfer this conflict into NATO, and NATO is not ready to face Russia in a military conflict and doesn't want it.
Okay, Peter, our last minute. I mean, as a Ukrainian yourself, is that okay with you if Ukraine pitches its neutrality, which basically is code for saying, okay, fine, we won't join NATO? Do you fear that would be appeasement in a sense, or are you okay with that?
It's very much a toxic issue, and the Ukrainian president has said that it has to be submitted to a referendum. Personally, I would say that it was already a non-starter. Ukraine was never becoming I would say, well, not never, but within 10 years, it's not. Obviously, NATO is seeing that. In fact, Ukraine should be considering whether to accept NATO because, Ukraine has shown the kind of fighting spirit none of the NATO countries currently has. Okay, that is just, it needs to be stated from the get-go. But I think a neutrality status is okay. But once again, who are we going to be negotiating and agreeing it with? Since Russia has been less than a trustworthy partner, it has to have some kind of ironclad guarantees. Much stronger than what it had with the Budapest Memorandum, where Russia guaranteed its security in return for nuclear weapons. And look where we've gotten. So I would say neutrality status is reasonable, but once again, my question is whether there's good faith on the part of Moscow to agree to that.
Peter Zalmayev, Sergey Utkin, and Enes Bayrakli. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you all so much for being with us, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this further very soon. Thanks to our viewers, of course, as well. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.